This video is to give some background information on how to analyze stories for your literary analysis paper. Ideally, you should have read St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves before you watch this video, but even if you haven't, I'm going to be explaining all the points that I make, so you're still going to get a lot of good information from watching it. So I wanted to start with the story, St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, and I want to suggest that, like the other stories that we're reading, it is an example of literary short fiction. And what I mean by literary short fiction is basically a story that's designed to communicate a message, and it's made up. The fiction part is that it's made up. And in the story, it's about these girls who have been raised by werewolves, so already there's some fantasy elements in the story, and the girls are learning how to become human. And then there's some problems that kind of come along with that. So if you can imagine these girls who were raised by wolves, they don't really know how to act human. They're being asked by these nuns who work at St. Lucy's to learn human traits. So let's take a look at some examples from the story to try to figure out what the story is about. Not just what happens, but what does it mean? That's kind of an important part of literary analysis. A literary analysis paper wouldn't just say, here's what happened in the story. It would focus on what does it mean? What do those moments in the story mean? So early on in the story, the narrator says, I remember how disorienting it was to look down and see my 2 square-toed shoes instead of my own 4 feet. So the narrator, whom we learn later on is named Claudette, she starts to see herself as an individual. And this is actually a contrast from the very beginning of the story, because the girls at the start kind of see themselves as a pack, just like a group of wolves would see themselves as a pack. And as they start to become individuals and see themselves as humans, they start to turn on each other. In fact, the next quotation says, the pack hated Jeanette, but we hated Mirabella more. We began to avoid her, but sometimes she'd surprise us curled up beneath the beds or gnawing on a scapula in the garden. And sort of we have to, a scapula, right, is a shoulder blade, so we have to picture this girl kind of gnawing on a bone in the garden. So the girl gnawing on the bone would be Mirabella, and the other girl, Jeanette. Jeanette is the one who adapts, the girl that adapts the most quickly and the most easily to becoming human or acting human. And then the girl Mirabella is the one who doesn't adapt at all, and in fact maintains her wolf-like traits all the way into the end of the story. And so these two girls kind of represent the extremes of the learning process that all the girls are engaged in. But as part of the learning process, they start to lose their sense of compassion. So one example of that would be this last quotation, when Mirabella comes and is trying to get some help from the narrator responds, lick your own wounds, I said, not unkindly. It was what the nuns had instructed us to say. Wound licking was not something you did in polite company. Well, the narrator kind of blames the nuns for her response, but she's kind of not explaining or not maybe taking responsibility for the fact that she is not being helpful to her sister at a time of need. And perhaps before they learned how to be human, they absolutely would have helped each other. So this is kind of an example of something, as much as they're gaining all these skills at being human, they're losing something that's essential and positive about being a wolf, which we wouldn't normally associate anything with being positive, or anything positive with being a wolf, but in this instance, we should see that. And then by the end of the story, what happens is the girls have to prove that they have learned how to become human. And it's kind of a strange way that they prove it. It's by doing a dance called the Sausalito, It's kind of a joke, I think, in the book. Um, and so the problem is that Claudette forgets the steps to the dance and therefore has trouble proving that she has learned how to adapt to being a human correctly. Um, so she tries to reach out for help. She looks to her sister Jeanette, who is the most adapted one, and Jeanette responds, "The steps." Then Jeanette gave me a wide, true wolf smile. For an instant, she looked just like our mother. "Not for you," she mouthed back. And so there's a way in which, again, this is kind of an example of that lack of compassion. And when we might think that, again, being human would be positive, this is sort of a moment when she the the sister who is the most adapted is also kind of the most ruthless of the pack. And then by the end of the story, there's this kind of suggestion that maybe the girls have learned how to, move from one culture to the other really easily. Like it says at stage 5, at this point, your students are able to interact effectively in the new cultural environment. They find it easy to move between two cultures. But I want to suggest that that's also problematic. In other words, that's not exactly true because at the very end of the story, Claudette says, "So," I said, telling my first human lie, "I'm home." Why? Because at the very end, she doesn't feel like she's home. She goes back to the cave where the werewolves are, and they are all sitting around this moose carcass and they're all eating it, and she's dressed in her school uniform and she looks perfectly human, and there's this huge contrast there. So, why did I, focus on those quotations specifically? Well, in order to figure out kind of what the point of the story is, we have to look at the details of what's happening in the story and make a series of educated guesses in order to arrive at what's called a literary theme. So when I say a literary theme, I just kind of mean what's a prominent message found in the story. And usually that message is expressed as an abstraction, and an abstraction is an idea. So we're going to try to come up with that message and express it as an idea. And in order to do that, we're going to have to make some inferences, kind of the way that I was, when I was saying, well, notice that we would think that this is positive, like that becoming a human is a positive trait, but notice how it's negative. That's kind of an educated guess on my part about what's going on in the story, like specifics in the story. So what kinds of themes could we pull from St. Lucy's? We could pull themes like assimilation, meaning the idea of um, having to adapt to a different culture and maybe change the way that we behave and the way that we think of ourselves. And acculturation is something very similar to that. Loss of empathy would be kind of going back to those examples that I was pointing out where the girls are not helping each other. Empathy being like the ability to feel what somebody else is feeling. So if you have like a lack of compassion would also be kind of an example of a loss of empathy. And loss of moral compass, meaning the loss of a sense of what's right and wrong. And cultural relativism means that basically no culture is better than any other culture, and we can kind of see that the story, with enough educated guesses, we can kind of see that the story is trying to suggest that it's wrong to look at one culture and say one culture is better than another culture. So now you might be saying, well, I'm not writing about St. Lucy's, so why does that matter? Well, I want to suggest to you that I'm trying to demonstrate how to use, how to think through the essay writing process and how to use a prompt too. So for instance, the, the assignment sheet is going to include several prompts, and a prompt, the way that I look at it is just a question designed to help you focus your paper, help you figure out what your paper is going to be about. So this example prompt is not on the assignment sheet, but let's just pretend that it is. What does St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves say about the relationship between one culture and another? Well, first we would have to look for some moments in the story where these two cultures are being compared. And then we'd have to think about what's the message about these two cultures in order to make a claim. So I want to suggest that you kind of have to make a claim for essay number, for the literary analysis paper. That claim basically means that you're arguing for your way of seeing the paper, or seeing the story as just as good as somebody else's way of looking at the story. So a response to the prompt might be something like this. Although the nuns claim that human culture is better, Russell's story makes it clear that the girls lose some important traits as they transition from being more wolf-like to being more human. So basically, the idea that while it might seem like human culture is better, and in fact the nuns say that it's better, um, the story gets us to kind of call that into question because of kind of what the training that the nuns are giving them is doing to them in terms of the way that they relate to one another. So when I say textual evidence, that phrase textual evidence on the slide, basically means what kind of quotation can I bring up to use as evidence to support the point that I'm trying to make. And that's essentially the way a paper is going to work. You try to make a claim about the story, and then you would use examples, and your paper is going to need to use specific quotations in your body paragraphs in order to support the points that you're making. And then hopefully what happens is you've found the right quotations that help to support your argument. And then you have to explain how those quotations connect back to your claim. So in general, then what we have to do is look at the prompts on the assignment sheet and ask ourselves, well, which of these prompts makes the most sense to me after you do your discussion boards about the stories? Which of these prompts makes the most sense, and how can I come up with some really good answers using the text of the story? So those are all things that you need to do in order to put together a good literary analysis paper. I just wanted to say thank you for listening.